This is Software-Defined Survival, where we explore how software-defined systems are changing the business of AV IT. Today on Software-Defined Survival.
Don't hook up things to the network just because you have a LAN port on it, or just because that might be needed. Ask your programmers to say, hey, just for the next, 10 minutes or hour or something, I want you to pretend you're a bad guy. And I want you to tell me all the bad things you could do if you had access to this system. The site tech and the lead techs, those are actually the most well-versed in terms of network security and in terms of what things could be vulnerable, but unfortunately, they're not part of the conversation as much as they should be.
Okay, before we get started, I'd like to quickly tell you about an email series we put together called Easy AV Upgrades. And it's just a few emails, a series of emails that gives you some new ideas about how to upgrade pretty much any AV system. All the upgrades require little to no extra hardware, and they're really all just a good way to get the most out of your investment or to add more value to the systems that you're already delivering. And you could get that by heading over to catchtechnologies.com/AV upgrades. That's catchtechnologies.com/AV upgrades. All right, on with the interview. Welcome to Software Defined Survival. This is Patrick Murray. And today, the last week or so, actually this year, cybersecurity in AV has been in the news quite a bit. So I'm really happy to talk about that today with Paul Konikowski, a longtime AV technology manager. Paul, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Patrick. Thanks for having me.
So before we jump into all of the different things that are going on out there in the AV world, I'd like to start with your story. So tell us about how you got into AV, how you got started, and how you wound up where you are today.
Sure. I started actually doing information technology help desk support back in high school and college. And I studied computer engineering in my undergrad. And by the time I got out of college, I really just wanted to work in concerts. Like a lot of folks in AV, had a big musical interest. I played guitar. And so I kind of hung up my degree for a little while. I went to work for a company called Snow Sound in the Northeast, became a sound guy basically for a few years. I was still doing some IT support on the side in the winter because it was very seasonal work, but really just got into the whole concert and event scene and learned, from the ground up. After a few years of that, I moved into AV integration. Again, starting on the ground side, building racks, pulling cables, terminating plates, hanging projectors, and that sort of thing. And then eventually landed a job as basically a junior engineer, where I took my own AutoCAD training. I got my CTS, and I convinced the company to hire me, even though I've never really done that role. And they really took me under their wing and taught me, all about codecs and at the time RGB HV switchers, touch panels, all of that stuff. So I did that for a couple years, and then decided to move to California. I was living in Connecticut at the time. That's where I grew up, and was really just looking for a change in scenery and to live somewhere else, for a while. So I made the move to the San Francisco Bay Area in, I believe it was 2007, and began working as an AV consultant there, really learning the interactions with the architects and the MEP engineers, specs, continuing to do AutoCAD drawings, worked on a lot of higher ed out there, some churches, some city council chambers, those sort of projects, and really, enjoyed the consulting role. And I was out of work for about 2 months last summer, which was, hard at the time, but in hindsight, it really was a blessing because it really made me look at where I was in the industry and where I wanted to go. And I decided that I wanted to get a little bit more into cybersecurity. And so I took a short course from Harvard called Cybersecurity Managing Risk in the Information Age. Really highly recommend that for anybody. It's like 8 or 10 weeks long. It gives you the basics of incident response plans, policy frameworks, a lot of case studies and things like that, and really, really enjoyed it. So decided to continue on that path and applied for a master's program at Georgia Tech, which is where I got my undergrad. They had just announced a new online cybersecurity master's program. And then I started the master's program in January and really enjoying it. It's quite challenging, but it feels like the right thing to do. And then I'm also working for a consulting firm that's based in DC who goes and handles a lot of military projects, government work. I hadn't ever really worked in the military government space before. And so learning their design criteria, their, the DoD directives and how you have to, work through a lot of paperwork really and interfacing with different military groups. And a lot of those also have a cybersecurity consultant on board, and they have cybersecurity breakout meetings now. And so I've been sitting in on some of those, and it really goes nicely hand in hand with the school that I'm getting. So, like I said, it was a blessing to get let go because it really opened up my career and made me think about where I wanted to be in the future. And I really do see the need for AV folks that also know cybersecurity and really just have it on their mind, and think about it when they're hooking things up to a network or, talking to clients. And I believe that AV manufacturers and integrators, if they haven't had to deal with this already, very soon they're going to have clients that say, okay, if you want to, be a part of this project, let's see your cybersecurity policy. Let's see the process you go through when interfacing with our IT department. What do you do when there's an incident? What are your third parties that you're working with, and what are their policies? And so that's really where I'm headed. I do know I'm learning a lot about the nuts and bolts at an academic sort of student level, but I'm really the program that I'm in now is really more focused on policy and the written side of it all. Navigating different laws, GDPR, local state laws. Having incident response plans and that sort of thing. And so, yeah, that's where I'm at right now. Still freelancing for the few companies that I mentioned, and sort of half and half with that in school. It's a good balance that leaves you with no extra time.
Thanks for that. Very interesting career arc, starting at an IT help desk and winding up where you are today. You mentioned things like RGBHV, which kind of gives us an idea of the timeline and how long you've been doing this. And just to give a little background of what's on my mind recently is during those RGBHV days, that was kind of like the beginning when network jacks started showing up on AV equipment. And we started using the network for control of devices. And we treated it just like we did serial, right? It's just a message that goes from one device to another. So things were unauthenticated and unencrypted normally, right? We would use Telnet. So there was normally not a login. You normally didn't encrypt the message. So it was in plain text on the network. If somebody was sniffing the network, they could see what it was. Big deal. They know how to turn on the video projector. And now in today's day and age, that's really not all that acceptable unless I have this theory you could segment, you could secure the network itself. So if you have unsecured devices on that secure network, they're still kind of in this shell. of protection. But that takes a lot of planning, right? You need to know where every port is for that network. And we have these extenders that extend network ports to underneath the table. And then that's no longer a secure network anymore because anybody could plug in there. And if they know the right commands, then they could do stuff with your system. They could even upload programs if they have the right software. So there's been lots of changes, and we haven't really been keeping up to date with the security aspect of things. Now, I know this is new for everybody, but I'm always looking for what's the practical application. What does it look like on the job site? What does it look like when we're installing and commissioning a system? So maybe we could just theorize a little, giving all of your background. You've been a consultant. You're looking into cybersecurity. You've taken some online courses about that. Now you're working in some military projects and seeing what their processes are like. And they even have security officers, cybersecurity officers. Just maybe paint a picture of what an ideal, let's say we're working with the same devices that we always have. We have some unsecured devices. We have some that could be enabled with a password. What does that look like in an AV project? Does a consultant, should they be specifying certain practices? Should an integrator be raising their hand and saying, hey, I've got unsecured devices on here. What do you want to do about that? Who should be managing the passwords? Maybe just give us your thoughts on what that process should look like.
Sure. Look like. Well, it's important to start the conversation as soon as possible. A lot of times it's an afterthought or post-PO sort of conversation where you start talking about IP addresses and VLANs and things like that. But it's much more important to start it way earlier and to really, go into a project and say immediately, we'd like to speak with your CISO or your IT department, and we'd like to get a copy of your cybersecurity policy if possible. And here's ours, here's our internal and our external policy, and just start it that way and make sure that those are in agreement. And then really look at each asset that you're going to be having in your system or interfacing with, and try to assess early on, just at a paper level, what the impact of each one is, in terms of, there's this CIA thing, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And if these devices were taken offline or were attacked, how bad of an impact would it be? Would it just be an inconvenience for a day or two, or would it really impact, operations, or in the military, would it impact a military operation? Because a lot of these things are, military things are drones now. And so folks might be flying drones from some of the buildings that I'm working in, tactical sort of thing. And so, really assessing how big of a deal it is for each device and categorizing that somewhat. And so that at least you have, some level of what's important, priority wise, and what's maybe not so, critical. And then really looking at, okay, well, what about, access to these devices? Who really needs to access it physically? Who should be able to access it, on a network? Is it a role-based access system, or is it individuals? And then also looking at it, because a lot of times it's called least privilege, giving only the certain individuals access to a resource. But then you also want to think about another principle that I've learned about called least route or least route. And that's something I didn't really think about before, but that's actually saying, don't just limit the individual access to a device, but limit the device's access to other things on the network. Don't hook up things to the network just because you have a LAN port on it, or just because that might be needed. If really think about every time you draw that line, that network connection, why am I doing this? And can I do it without that? Can I do this? Can I set up the AV control network so it really doesn't touch the the local area network, or when it does, that it just touches at one point, and then maybe at that point you can set up a firewall, or you can set up some other access controls. So it's not a bunch of devices sitting on the local network. It's really just one, maybe just your controller, or of course video conference codec. Those need to go on the network, and so really spelling all of that out early on before, I don't want to say, ideally before the sale, if you have a consultant on board, or you're able to get in there and have those conversations early. But certainly, if you do make the sale, before you start really doing any of the implementing or the drawings or any of that, really having that conversation up front with the client. And so all of the expectations are set very early on, and really try to put on that malicious actor hat. A lot of folks just don't think about what could happen, like the bad guy that's on the inside. A lot of people will look at a device and say, there's this vulnerability in this control system, but you'd have to go to the AV rack and you'd have to plug in your laptop to it, and then you could launch a command shell, and like you said, upload some malicious software, whatever. And they think, well, that will never happen. But you have to really look at it from that regard and say, okay, if I have a malicious actor internally, what damage could they really do here? And then you start to think about things like just the USB ports on these devices, or the SD card ports. And what would happen if someone, either just damaged the device or was able to upload malware through your USB port? If you have an AV device sitting on a local area network, and you can easily plug in a USB device to it that has, some sort of malware or worm on there, that can then find its way through the network to other people's computers. And that's a new reality that we have to think of. The Target breach was a real eye-opener to the government, because the systems got infected through the HVAC control system. And that control system was hooked up to their point of sale devices. And so no one really thought, that was really a threat before. But how often are we as AV integrators sitting on the same network as HVAC control, or, these other systems? And you think, well, no one has access to that, but do they have, physical access to it? And so really thinking about it on what they call a defense in depth strategy, where you look at it at every layer of the OSI model, including the human layer. And so I know I'm talking in really broad terms now, but you kind of have to start there. You can't just start with, oh, do we want this, on a VPN or not, or things like that. You have to start on the broad, who's going to have access, who should have access, what devices should be on the network, and should they be on the network at all? And I'm one of these people that's now, I used to be the guy that if I saw a LAN port on a device, a projector, for instance, like you mentioned, I would just, call for a LAN outlet on the ceiling and say, well, we might need that in the future, or we might, if we might put in room view or something else, we're going to want that. Now I'm the complete opposite. I actually say, why are we doing this? Why on earth, would we put anything on the network? Because our stuff is could be a pivot point or another way into the network. So really put your malicious actor hat on and say, how bad could I damage the system if that was my intent? Or, can users accidentally, can a user accidentally do something here? We extend room PC USB imports, inputs to the table all the time, right? We use these USB extenders, and we say, oh, though that's for, the keyboard or mouse, or maybe it's for, someone to load up their own presentation. Well, you're basically giving them a key to your rack in a way, and you're extending something that may not be such a great idea, even if it adds convenience. is there another way to do that that's more secure, where you're not, giving anyone access to that sort of stuff? So, from my standpoint, it has to start early, and it has to be a conversation that you have with your clients before you get down to, IP addresses. And a lot of people, talk about VLANs. Well, VLANs are great for keeping traffic off of other parts of the network, segmenting in terms of traffic and bandwidth. They're actually not a solution for security, because VLAN headers, as far as I understand, again, I'm still kind of new to this, but you can spoof those pretty easily. A header and a packet, you can change the man in the middle could change the header. And so it's not hard to jump to another VLAN or to inject packets or whatever. So VLAN is one of those things in AV where a lot of people think, well, that'll keep me secure, but it's really not. And teaching folks about that, I think, is important. So, and then talking to the IT departments and talking about access control list and closing ports that don't need to be open, and monitoring that traffic, enabling logging on your devices. A lot of our, the recent vulnerabilities that came out in AV devices, using a touch panel to spy on somebody or something, that one came out. Well, is the device logging everything that's going on? And so if there's been no reports of someone doing this, can you go back into the device and look at the logs? And so really, enabling those logs and trying to centralize them somewhere if possible, so that, a forensics team or a security group can look at the logs when they need to, or they should actually be doing it more periodically. And then, we just password protecting everything, even the switches. And one thing I learned in the Cisco intro class is that you can put a password on a Cisco switch, but it's not hard to retrieve that password or reset it. And there's different ways to put in passwords where you're encrypting the password, or you're restricting someone from just pulling it up. Someone that plugs into the configuration port, can they just pull that up? And so really trying to lock down, instead of taking this open attitude, really thinking, well, why am I doing this? And when I do it, what's the most secure way to do it? And then monitoring it, like I said, logging and monitoring, looking for abnormalities. Should a device be transmitting data out? What kind of data should a device be sending out? And are you monitoring for those abnormal transmissions? Is someone keeping an eye on that? Or is it sending an email to someone saying, hey, by the way, someone came in over the weekend and fired up the conference room system? Now, maybe that person was just testing out a big presentation that they had to do on Monday, and they wanted to make sure they felt comfortable in front of the team. But it's that sort of anomaly detection that you want to start looking for. It's not just about antivirus, which is looking for, known signatures. You want to start looking for just weird activity in a network. So I know I'm kind of rambling here, and it may not be all that practical, but I think it's important to really have, that attitude, and then you can start drilling down to, locking unused ports, access control list, firewall, implementation, intrusion detection systems. What other ones am I blanking on here? Always have backups of your software. Really, I think it's important to have the conversation and to teach your programmers, your engineers, your network architects to put security first. Don't do it as an afterthought.
So I've got an entire page of notes now, and we could end the podcast right now, but So all of this, if I'm competing on a project that will be decided on on lowest price, I'm going to lose if I implement just the third of what you said. Any thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, to me, it's yeah, you might lose that business, but you need to think about how much it's going to cost you when there is an incident, right? And so if you're not implementing the security controls both internally and on your project, then you are making it easier for attackers to come in and steal data. And that sort of thing is going to cost you a whole lot of money. And so is it worth it? Is it worth it? You can sort of look at it like speeding, right? On the highway, sure, I can drive a little faster and get there a little bit sooner. But I'm risking one, getting a ticket from somebody, right? From a police officer, or a state trooper, but you're also risking, killing somebody, yourself, your passengers, or other people in the car. And, so it turns out to be, not worth it. And so if you're, being the lowest bidder and going around these sort of, practices, then, it's going to come back and haunt you in the end. It's also another way to think about it is I know some bidders, especially out west, I was really shocked at some of the Wild West attitudes where some bidders weren't, they may not be doing as-built, of jobs, but some weren't even doing drawings. They were winning jobs and not even doing drawings. And they say, well, sometimes we do a little pencil sketch, or, sometimes we have just general, we do mics 1 and 2, and then we start doing wire tags and things like that. We just have sort of conventions that we all go by. And I was like, you're doing installs without drawings? Like, I couldn't believe it, but that's how they were winning them. And they would go in and get it working and then run away and have no documentation, no training, anything like that. And it's going to catch up to you, and you have to, be disciplined enough to say, am I going to be that kind of provider?
Well, that's an interesting point. It will catch up to somebody. Of course, the reputation of a company is very important, but the install that gets done and you run away and there's no drawings, it catches up with the end user. So circling back to the security question and implementing all of these good practices, we're not lawyers. I'm not a lawyer. You're not a lawyer. But where does that liability kind of fall in the end? There's black boxes developed by manufacturers. There's an integrator who installs the stuff and commissions it, but it's ultimately on an end user's network. So I can imagine that question could get pretty complicated.
Yeah, and there's no really good answer to that right now, because there's so many different laws in each state, in the state side, and then there's the GDPR, which I'm sure you're familiar with. But what I've learned is that there is no where do you stop? And look at third parties, right? So let's say you're an end user, a large financial firm or something like that, and you get breached, and then they start looking at, your policies and what you've done. They really look at what you've done to prevent it. And the more you show that you've been trying to prevent it and not be negligent, that actually takes down your liability quite a bit. Just showing that you were doing cyber awareness training and you had a policy in place. And then they start saying, okay, well, let's look at your third party vendors, and because maybe one of them was the whole, and where you work with them. So you start looking at that, and then from there you can actually go another round out, right, to their third party vendors, because we're all connected in the end, right? So it's a moving target and discussion, and who's liable? There's no clear answer right now, and so what you want to do is sort of, cover your own butt a bit, implement, like I said, the cyber awareness training and other things internally, so that if you are called into court or you are asked to, hey, it looks like this may have come from you. That's a whole nother topic of attribution. Where did the problem come from? You can at least show that you weren't being negligent. That you weren't just ignoring the problem, and that actually reduces your liability quite a bit. So, to me, you have to at least go one rung out. All AV integrators should be looking at the policies and practices of all of their suppliers, right? If I'm a manufacturer, I should be looking at the policies of all of my suppliers and all of my customers. And so at least go one degree out. And if the answer is we don't have a policy, or we don't have that in place, you might consider not doing business with them, because it's just or at least putting some pressure on them to get that done. How far it goes out, I haven't seen that happen yet, where the AV folks were. I think there might have happened a couple of years ago, where the AV provider was held liable for a data breach or something like that. But there's certainly other examples outside of AV land. Like I said, Target and their HVAC system provider, it looks like that's where that breach happened. So that's really not all that different from an AV provider, right? We're kind of in the same second tier. And so I really want people to learn from those things and then try to apply them to the AV folks. But it's a moving target. That's what I've learned, is that depending on the court, the state, the actual case, how far they go out to check for, or how far should you go out to check for other people's security policies. You should at least go one step out. You don't have to ask for your vendors, their vendors, but at least ask them, and then they should be asking their next step.
So you mentioned the first thing to look for is if they have a security policy. But if they do have one, what's just some brief, what are you looking for without becoming a cybersecurity expert or actually going to a lawyer and having them review it? What are just some bullet points that you're looking for in a security policy?
Sure. You're looking so that they have a culture of awareness throughout their entire organization. And so you want to see things like an incident response plan, what they're going to do and who they're going to contact, what media outlets, if something does happen, like a ransomware attack or something, what do they do? What do they communicate to their employees? What do they communicate to the outside people? What do they communicate to their third-party vendors? You want to look for things like cyber awareness training, and that's ongoing, because the biggest cyber threat for most organizations is the human factor, is social engineering, either a phishing email that someone gets, or they open up their Gmail on their work computer, or they maybe grab I see this pile of USB drives on the lobby counter. Oh, someone dropped those off, and they grab a USB drive thinking it's a free USB drive. Well, that's actually a step that penetration testers do. I know some guys that are penetration testers, and they do the phishing campaigns and the emails, but they also will drop off USB drives at hospitals or schools. And then once someone plugs them in, then they have access to that person's computer. And so having ongoing training, where you train all employees about just the basics of being more cyber aware, having penetration testing done. There's software and software as a service companies that will provide both. And if you have less than something like 500 employees, or you only do 12 phishing test emails a year, something like that, it's free. A lot of them are just free for smaller companies. And you start by just short little videos. You tell your employees, hey, I need you to watch this video before you start your day today. And it's a 5-minute video or 10-minute video, and teaches them a little bit of basic. And maybe you get one of those a month. And then every 3 months or so, you send out this phishing test email and see, and it gives you a report of how many employees actually opened it. And so let's say it's 50%. Well, as the time goes on, every 3 months or so that you're doing this, you should be seeing that percentage go down. And you should be also getting an idea of who's not opening the email or who's not watching the videos. Maybe give them a little extra training. Maybe say, hey, you've been selected as a, vulnerable person or something. I don't know. And so getting back to your original question, what are you looking for? You want a company that does that. And you want them to show that it's the percentage of people opening that their training is effective. And that's not just for me checking out another company, but this actually falls back to that liability in court, in that sort of cases, or when you talk about cybersecurity insurance. If you can show that you're training your employees and you can show that training is effective over time, you may not get it down to 0, but you might reduce the opening of these phishing emails from 50% down to 25, let's say. You're showing that you're actually making strides towards security. And you want to see that sort of attitude about it. And then you want to see policies about bring your own device policies. And you want to see things about, USB drives, and how those shouldn't be brought in, or how also you want to see things like, what's it called? Data protection. I just learned about this, where you're monitoring people leaking data. If I do save a spreadsheet from the server to a USB drive, is that monitored? Is that logged somewhere? What's stopping an internal employee from emailing financial data out to someone? And when that happens, can you attribute that to the person? And so you want to see things like that in place, and that shows you that they do, have this attitude of security. And then bigger corporations will ask you sometimes to modify your policy because it doesn't quite match theirs. They may say, "Oh, we need," I don't know a good example, but they may ask you for a bit more. And they also may ask you, well, how are you going to interface with our IT department? What's your standard process for going through, if it's a military job, how do you work with the military to make sure that by the end of the project, all of the paperwork and all of the access is in order, and they want to see that process outlined before you even begin. And so, yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot of work, Patrick. I mean, don't get me wrong. And it's one of those things that, one, you have to start somewhere, kind of like you said earlier. But it's also never ending. Unfortunately, it can go on, and as more and more threats emerge, your training is going to have to be a bit adopted, and it's just this never-ending thing. And so you also want to just have a plan for it and say, well, this is how much we're going to spend this year on cybersecurity. This is how much we're going to spend this year on training. There's ways to calculate that based on your risk. A lot of times it's actually cheaper just to buy insurance than it is to implement some of these programs or whatever. But there are ways to at least get the basics down. And then, look at your cybersecurity insurance policy also. And sometimes a company may want to see that too, and make sure that they're covered.
So a lot of the things you just mentioned, I think are, like you said, it's a lot of work, no doubt, and it's an ongoing thing. I think it's easy to imagine how to implement that in an office setting. But what I'm concerned about is how that's going to play out with field technicians. So when you're on a job site with a laptop, it's not uncommon to put the source code on a USB stick and give it to your colleague so we could run off to another room, or to use things like Dropbox to share code, or store passwords in an Excel list that's put in the Dropbox to store code. So that's really my main concern. Do you have any ideas about how to manage that being on site? You mentioned this company before that wasn't doing drawings, and we're moving more towards, I just don't see any other way than to completely remove that on-site programmer and handle everything in a very process-oriented IT-like manner. But I know that change will not come quickly, and it may take some kind of an event to really capture people's attention. But what do you think about that on-site technician who needs to have that data kind of mobile?
I think it kind of falls back to changing the attitude to a more cyber aware type group. Some of the best cybersecurity guys that I've met in the industry are actually on-site techs. It actually tends to be, and this is maybe a little bit a bit of ageism, so I apologize for that, but it's when you look at the folks that are uncovering some of these vulnerabilities or blogging about them, a lot of times they are the 20-somethings, that are just getting into the industry, and they enjoy looking for these sort of things. And the older generation, at least the older mindset, is more of for availability and keeping things easy. And so what I would recommend is really trying to implement that within an organization. Let's say you have let's say you're an integrator and you have a group of programmers, and they're all kind of doing their own thing. They may have templates or something that they go off of. They may have a giant server database, not even a real database, but just folders, of all of their old code. And then they may have some sort of web access or, ways for techs in the field to quickly grab code and implement it on a device, right? That's not an uncommon scenario right now. Well, there's a whole host of problems with that because, first of all, can someone go in and just delete all of that, with one swipe? Can they offload that entire set of code to a USB drive and take it somewhere else and steal intellectual property? And so teaching them how bad it could be. In other words, in a way, you want to teach them to think more like a bad guy, and teaching them, okay, we're putting in this new system, which may be a little bit more, a little bit less convenient for you, but here's why. And then also maybe taking a little bit more of an open source attitude, where one programmer, and I don't know if this is totally true or not, but I think in a lot of cases the programmers, they get their basic code ready, they go on site, they tweak it to get it working, and then they walk away. Is that fair to say?
I think that's fair. Yeah.
And they rarely have someone else check their code.
Code reviews. Yeah.
So doing code reviews and security code reviews where you have, some sort of, I don't know, it could be Microsoft Teams or something like that, where you say, hey, looking for a security review on this code, and have someone else look at it with a different set of eyes. Instead of getting this working, what vulnerabilities do I see? Putting their code out there, either within an organization or on a more industry-wide level, and saying, here's my code, putting it on actually a website and giving it away. That's a very different attitude than most AV integrators have. Most AV integrators think, that's my work, why would I put that out there? But if you put it out for more scrutiny from the good guys, right, from folks that are going to look at it and say, hey, by the way, these are the risks that you're taking by doing what you're doing, you might consider this instead. By doing that, you're identifying those risks before they get on site, right? Before it's actually in a room, and hopefully before the bad guys figure it out.
Yeah.
And so taking a more open source sort of attitude, doing more more cross-checking, more security auditing of code, at the same time locking it down in a way where it's still available to the tech, but if that tech does download it from your Dropbox or something, that there's some record of that. That who's taken code out of your database and who hasn't, and you can attribute correctly if someone does steal your entire database, or if someone does start messing with other people's programs. Most people don't like to think about, did I hire a bad actor? But you have to assume you've hired the next, Edward Snowden. You have to assume you've hired somebody who may be financially influenced to do something bad for your company. They may be offered a certain amount of money by a competitor or by someone else who says, hey, if you get me, if you can set up this thing where I can see into this meeting, or I can see, then I'll give you this much money. And there's also blackmail. A lot of people, there's stories about people getting blackmailed into doing things that they wouldn't normally do. So you kind of have to put on that hat somewhat and ask your programmers to say, hey, just for the next 10 minutes or hour or something, I want you to pretend you're a bad guy, and I want you to tell me all the bad things you could do if you had access to this system. And it just changes that mindset a bit. So, and honestly, the on-site techs are probably the best first for that. They're probably the ones that know how to do the most damage. Back when I did IT support, we used to kind of joke about, how much damage we could do if needed or something like that. I had a guy I knew a friend that worked in network backbone, on the internet provider level. I forgot who he worked for, but I said to him one day over dinner, I said, so, you're kind of in there, managing the internet, he was in DC area. And I said, how much damage could you actually do? And he said he could probably take down most of the internet on the East Coast for a couple hours, and nowadays I bet he couldn't. I bet nowadays they have a lot more protections in place, and he's a good guy. He's not going to do that. You know what I mean? But you have to kind of put on that black hat for a minute and say, all right, if I was a malicious actor, what could I do? And sometimes it's not that big of a deal. Sometimes you might say, well, if I had access to this and I went into a conference room and I loaded this code, then I could do this in theory. And you might say, well, the chances of that actually happening.
Then you could assess the risk. Yeah.
Or it might be a high chance of something happening, i.e. the Zoom vulnerability that was shown last week. That actually was a huge worldwide chance. But you might say, well, what kind of damage actually could be done? Like someone can launch a webcam in someone's office. Okay, that's definitely an invasion of privacy. But can they steal files? Can they steal social security numbers that way? Well, no, they can't, or probably can't. So you kind of do, well, how wide is the impact? The site techs, they and the lead techs, those are actually the most well-versed in terms of network security and in terms of what things could be vulnerable. But unfortunately, they're not part of the conversation as much as they should be.
Yeah, I think that's probably the most actionable advice you've given, is just taking an hour a week and doing some role playing. That's something everybody could execute on. And even if you don't take action on any of those things, at least you know about it and you could report it to your customers. And again, you're getting it out there in the open. But at the same time, I'm really skeptical because of a lot of the things you mentioned: code reviews, tracking who has the code. You said it, more, do more. And the problem is budgets aren't getting bigger. And until security is budgeted for, these things just are not going to happen unless we just completely change the way that projects are run.
I'm going to counter that just for a moment with a little bit of slightly political talk. There was a tax reform passed, about a year and a half ago, which gave C corporations a whole bunch more money in their pocket, instantly, because of this tax reform. And so where did that money go? It doesn't apply to all integrators and all manufacturers. If they're an S corp, they didn't benefit from it as much. but that was a big chunk of extra cash coming back where they didn't have to pay taxes on it. And I don't know where it went to in a lot of places. So you take that, and then you also take the fact that our economy is banging right now, and supposedly the AV industry is exploding. And so, what are you doing with this extra money? Is it just going to the C-suite, or is it going towards things like cybersecurity? And I believe that there is money for it and there is time for it. And it doesn't have to cost you all that much. Like you said, it could be an hour a week. Or you can set up also just little rewards programs. If someone in your company identifies a vulnerability, they get a $25 Amazon gift card, or if a programmer says, brings up something at one of these meetings that they don't get shushed, you're being paranoid, don't worry about that they get rewarded. And so it changes the attitude of the company. And if you're giving away $100 worth of gift cards a week, that's nothing compared to how much, tax reform money that's come in, or how much it's going to cost you when something goes wrong. So I believe that there is money for that. And it doesn't have to be a race to the bottom in terms of bids and that sort of thing. I understand, bid, we got to be competitive in this, that's a whole nother topic we can talk about, Patrick. The race to zero in terms of profit and margins. But, if we can't do it now in this economy, what are we going to do when the economy goes south? What are we going to do when there's, really no money laying around? So I believe that we should be taking that extra cash that we're getting in the industry right now and putting it towards these things. To me, there's no longer a choice. If you relate it to, I often relate cybersecurity to IT for social media. As a company's small, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, whatever, they might do their own IT, and as they grow, they realize, hey, I need to outsource this. And at some point they say, hey, I need an IT person in-house. Now that's normal, right? Same thing happened with social media. They probably tried to do it themselves first and did a terrible job. And then they hired someone like me who might know a little bit more about it. But more importantly, I made it my priority to get it done. You didn't wait till the end of the week to write a blog. I would have it done first thing Monday morning. And then eventually they all hired social media people to be in-house, right? That know way more than I ever did. Well, now the same thing's going to happen with cybersecurity. People are just sort of trying to do it by themselves. And then they'll probably start outsourcing a little bit to get, a little bit of consultation. And then eventually they're going to hire people in-house that know it, because they're not going to have a choice. You can't not have a website right now, right? You can't be in business and not have a website. But, 30 years ago, there were people saying, what do I need a website for? What do I need a social media person for? And guess what? They found that money, because it's not a choice anymore.
Great thoughts. I really appreciate it. Do you have any final thoughts for us?
I want, and we didn't touch on this, but I hope that the AV industry, looks at with some recent developments, not just in Zoom and other, Crestron and other vulnerabilities, but really looks at the Draper ransomware attack. Because the Draper, and it's still developing, there hasn't been much information on that, what the impact was. We definitely know their operations have been impacted, and they're probably losing a little bit of business, just trying to get back up to speed. But I want everyone to think about, well, what if their data was breached? What if all of their financial data, and what if all of their employee social security numbers were released? And I actually wrote a paper about that. It's going to be coming out soon. Not a paper, it's a school attitude. An article about that's going to be coming out soon. And to read about things like the Sony hack and the Target hack and the city of Atlanta and some other ransomware attacks that have happened, and stop thinking that it's not going to happen to you, because the bad guys, they first went after the big financial corporations and the government, and then they went after Target and Anthem and these other ones. And you think, well, those companies are so big. You hear these numbers from, oh my goodness, millions of people, whatever. Well, they're working their way down, and now they're going after local city governments, water companies, school districts. And when they start to get wind of how the AV industry, hasn't been taking security all that seriously, they're going to start coming after us. And the researchers are already doing it. You start to see more security researchers now looking at AV devices and discovering the vulnerabilities in them. So it's already a trend in that world. And if it's a trend in that world, then it's also a trend in the bad guy world. And so, this Draper one is the first big ransomware attack that I've heard of in the industry. And I just want companies just for a minute to think, okay, what if Monday I came in, all of our servers were down, all of the computers had a big skull and crossbones on it, the phones didn't work. What would we do to get out of that situation? And then also, what if that bad actor took all of our data and put it out on the internet? What are you going to do? And it's scary. I know I'm sort of, putting the fear there, but it's much better to think about it before it happens and have a plan in place than to wait until it does happen. So that's my final thought.
All right. Well, thanks for helping me lose some sleep tonight. If anybody would like to get in touch with you, how would they go about doing it?
We should do like a horror story, like a campfire story, like
exactly.
where we almost tell ghost stories around the campfire.
Just scare the crap out of each other. Yeah.
So the best way to find me or reach me is to search PK Audiovisual, all one word, on the interweb, and that's my handle on Twitter, PK Audiovisual. That's also the name of my blog website, and it's my handle on LinkedIn, which is another great way to reach me. If you want to try, spell my name, it's Konikowski, and you can find me out there. But PK Audiovisual, you'll probably hit at least one of the sites that way, and you can reach out to me that way.
Excellent. Paul, thanks for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you, Patrick. I really enjoyed it.
If you or anyone on your staff ever considered themselves just an AV programmer, join the club. That's how I used to feel. I was just an AMX programmer or just a Crestron programmer, whatever language of your choice is, whatever it may be. There's generally this feeling in AV that we're not capable of using modern programming languages. And it simply isn't true. Sure, there's a learning curve, but once you get through it, all other languages become easier to learn, and it just expands the amount of options you have when designing a system. It's not an either-or decision. You don't say, I won't be using these manufacturer tools anymore. It's just you have a broader palette to choose from. And here's what Mark Day, founder of IdeaBox, had to say about his experience with the online courses at learnavprogramming.com.
Patrick, it's funny how the smallest things can sometimes be the start of really big ideas. Before I took the learnavprogramming.com courses, I was in that proprietary, I'm only a control system programmer kind of mindset, right? When it came to new technologies or current technologies like JavaScript or things like that, for some reason I thought that was different from what I'm doing. And what taking your courses flipped for me was not so much what I learned technically taking the courses, it was the mindset of, oh, wait a second, I'm already doing 99% of what some of these most modern programmers are doing. I just have to learn, the other 1%. And that's really what I did. So it's really been kind of a big change after taking the course. And I would really recommend this course to any integrator. Not only will it obviously help their skill set, but more importantly, it might change their whole mindset, which is more important, and really show them new opportunities, open the door so they kind of see problems through a different lens. I gotta tell you, one of the biggest changes for me was as soon as I taught myself HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and saw the UIs that I can make with those technologies, I just couldn't sell a Crestron touch panel again.
Mark is a great example of somebody who takes new information and really applies it. I know that Mark still sells a lot of Crestron equipment, but for him, for his company, for his customers, for his business, he needed a better UI. He needed another option for a user interface, and modern programming allowed him to do that. So the question is, how can you use modern programming to improve your business? Please go to learnavprogramming.com, and wherever you see a sign up button, go ahead and sign up, and you'll get some free information to get a feel of my learning style and what kind of information is available. And of course, it would be an honor to have you enroll in one of our courses and help you upgrade your skills and take this industry to the next level. Thanks for listening to Software Defined Survival. I hope you found it useful, and maybe it inspires you to try out something new this week. If you have any questions, go to softwaredefinedsurvival.com and click the appropriate button. I'd love to answer your questions on the air. And if you'd like to help spread the word, please subscribe, comment, and share it with your friends. Thanks.